Chapter 5. Pat Stevens had no idea how far they rode upward into the foothills. Only half conscious. He was too busy trying to figure out what had happened to spend any mental effort on the physical realities of the moment. It was clear that this band of night riders had expected to meet him out on the road, had, at least, expected to meet someone from whom they had mistaken as him. The only way they could have mistaken him for someone else, he reasoned, was the fact that they accepted Clarence's statement that Pat was guilty of doing away with Moses Higgins. In other words, they had been waiting there, evidently by prearrangement, expecting to contact Higgins' killer. That much of it made sense, but that was only part of the whole nightmarish situation that did make sense. Harry had intimated that they didn't know too much about the setup hereabouts, and this seemed to indicate they were likely lately arriving members of the gang who mistook him for their local representative. Some goddamn thing like that, Pat thought to himself wearily. He wouldn't be able to fool them very long unless he got hold of some inside information to be able to pretend that he knew what was going on. The cryptic information contained in Higgins' letter wasn't worth a damn. Mose had merely hinted at some sort of desperate situation confronting him and had vaguely mentioned receiving some sort of warnings. And the conversation he had overheard between the girl and Clarence didn't clarify much of either. The hell of it was, he couldn't ask questions of anybody without revealing the truth about himself. Both Helen and the gang members accepted him as being one of them. Pat realized he wasn't thinking very clearly as he was jolted along through the night towards some unknown destination. He had been played the damn fool back at the Higgins ranch by not declaring his identity and explaining his presence immediately. But it had looked like a good idea at the time, and now it was a cinch that Helen wouldn't believe him if he did get a chance to talk to her alone. And Helen's presence was the worst part of the whole dang thing. He felt that he'd gotten her into it. She had taken his part with Clarence, and she would have had ridden towards town for the sake of ensuring his own safety to get delivered to the jail. Pat's thoughts wandered off again, irrationally. There was something damn funny about that deputy sheriff, about the way the gang of men had dismissed him so casually. They didn't seem to be a bit worried about the law following them. Most outlaws would have put a bullet into the deputy sheriff who happened to be around when they decided to rescue a killer and kidnap a young girl. Could be they weren't outlaws at all. Maybe nothing was what it seemed to be. Maybe he was crazy and nothing was like Powder Valley at all. They topped over a long ridge and descended a steep slope into the bottom of a narrow ravine. The riders ahead seemed to know exactly where they were going. They turned up the ravine between a forbidden walls of rock. The moon had come out from behind the clouds, but the bottom of the dark ravine remained cloaked in darkness. A will-o'-the-wisp light flickered ahead above the shoulders of the riders. It appeared to dance on and off as they followed the winding course of the stream bed upward, and Pat couldn't figure out whether it was an actual light or a product of his feverish imagination. For a long time it appeared to be moving ahead of them steadily at about the same gait as they were riding, then all at once it was right in front of them, burning brightly, a lantern hanging outside the door of a low log house built solidly upon the rock wall of the overhanging cliff. Pat swayed in the saddle and clutched the horn tightly with both hands when they come to a stop. Riders dismounted and came back to cut the ropes that were holding him into the saddle. He swayed sideways into their arms and was carried inside to a large, dimly lit room with rough solitude. He saw Helen Higgins standing in the center of the room as he was laid on the floor inside. Her face was dead white, but she appeared completely composed. Harry was holding her onto her arm, and he was saying with a leer, "Don't you worry none. Maybe this ain't so fancy, but I reckon you can put up with it for the sake of—" Helen tore herself away from his grasp with a little cry, and she ran to the far corner of the room where the figure of a man lay outstretched in the dark shadows. She dropped to her knees beside the still form while the men watched her in amazement. She fell forward and buried her face on the rain-drenched body and sobbed vehemently. Harry shot a queer look at Pat, laying on the floor, and asked aloud, "Now, what the hell you reckon?" He walked forward towards the girl's side, and Helen shrank away from him, her features distorted with grief. "Why didn't you tell me?" she cried out. "Why didn't you tell me my dad was here dead?" Harry shook his head, looking completely baffled. Your daddy? Sure, that ain't seem a very nice thing for a girl to walk in on. Sure enough, we didn't know. He swung around to glare at Pat. "Why didn't you tell us? What the hell did you bring him here for?" Pat closed his eyes without replying. He needed time to think of an answer. His brain was in a whirl. How could Mose Higgins be here, dead so many miles away from the ranch? They had ridden a couple hours, he figured. All he could think of was that this circumstance could prove to the girl that he couldn't have done it. One of the other men, standing over him, told Harry, "He passed out again. Want I should dose him with some water?" "I'll let him lay," Harry said sharply. He scowled in black decision. "Something's damn funny about all this," he decided. "Wish Lacy was here to put us straight." Pat kept his eyes closed and lay inert. He heard the men moving about and familiarizing themselves with the interior of the cabin, which was well stocked with a supply of stable food, and heard Harry order the horses unsaddled and a guard set at the downstream approach. Through it all, Helen's quiet sobbing in her corner of the big one-roomed cabin was a pitiable background for the other noises. After a time, a fire was got going in the big wood range, and heat and the smell of strong coffee began to permeate the cabin. Pat tried to elbow himself up and managed to get up on one elbow. Harry and 3 others were tipping back in chairs against the wall and watched him interestedly. When he showed signs of life, Harry turned to Helen and ordered her roughly, "Cut out your crying and get yourself over there to see how bad that wahoo is. Nursing's a woman's job." Pat saw Helen hesitate a moment, then slowly came across the room towards him. He eased himself down on his back and stared up at her pinched white face, drained all of emotion except of hatred. With a shock, he realized that her hatred was directed directly at him. Hell, he couldn't blame her. Not with her thinking he was responsible for her father's death. She listlessly unbuttoned his clothes and turned them back to expose the bandages that she had placed on his wounds. Her fingers were icy cold when they inadvertently touched his bare flesh, and after a quick examination, Helen shrank away from him as though he were unclean and said tonelessly, "The blood is clotted again. He'll be all right if he stays quiet." "I don't trust her, Harry," one of the armed men spoke up importantly. "Be just like her to let him bleed to death lying there." Helen whirled on the man and flung at him savagely, "You needn't worry about that. I'll do my best to see he don't die so easy. He'll live to hang. You hear me?" She stamped her foot angrily. "I'll see that's the best I can." The men gawped loudly. Harry said, "I don't reckon the gal likes you so much, partner," said to Pat. Pat Stevens lifted himself painfully into a sitting position. Through set teeth he demanded, "Give me a cup of coffee to warm the inside of my belly." Without moving from his tilted back chair, Harry ordered one of the men fussing over the hot stove, "Fill him up a cup. You feel like doing some talking yet?" he said to Pat. "About what?" "Lots of things." Harry's voice was even but threatening. "Looks to me like you messed up here pretty good. Why'd you bring that dead man here and then go back and get yourself shot and picked up by the deputy?" Pat murmured, "I had a right to go back for the gal, didn't I?"
Oh, that's it, huh?
Harry's voice grew colder.
You know what Lacy says about mixing women with business.
One of the men handed Pat a cup of steaming coffee, and he lifted it shakingly to his lips and burned his belly with a draught. His lips curled back from his teeth as strength re-entered his body with the near-boiling potion. Tentatively, he said, "To hell with Lacy."
Sounds to me like you're getting a little too smart for your britches,
Harry grunted.
Got the big head handling things over here on your own for a couple months. Lacy'll take that out of you pretty quick.
Pat sat cross-legged, nursing the cup of hot coffee between his calloused palms. He was treading on thin ice, and he knew it. Every time he opened his mouth, he was in danger of saying the wrong thing and arousing the gang's suspicion. But he was in danger of discovery every moment he sat there anyway. Mose Higgins' real killer might ride up at any moment, and his masquerade as a member of the gang would be pierced. It must have been he who'd left the lantern outside after placing Mose's body in the cabin. That meant he expected to return at once. Something must have delayed him, but Pat had no way of knowing how long he'd be delayed. He growled, "I'll take my chances with Lacy." He emptied the cup of strong coffee and felt well again. Now if he just had a gun in one of his holsters. Harry tipped his chair forward and got up. He strode forward towards Helen. She backed away from him until the wall was cut off in her retreat. Harry's cruel mouth twisted into a grin when he slid one arm around her slim waist and he sneered at Pat.
Kinda went to a lot of trouble for nothing, looks like. I ain't gonna be sore at you none for bringing this gal around tonight. It won't be so cold sleeping with her for company.
"Take your hands off her," Pat said angrily. "She's my—" Harry coughed loudly, and he pinched Helen's chin.
"In the shape you're in," he told Pat pointedly, "I reckon you couldn't do a gal like this much good."
Pat Stevens lifted himself to his feet with great effort. He swayed forward drunkenly, and then straightened. He took a quick, faltering steps, giving the impression that his knees were ready to buckle under him at any moment. The movement brought him close to the man tending the stove. Pat's right hand snaked out and jerked the man's gun from its holster, and he whirled in a half-crouch, covering Harry with the weapon. With grim deliberation, he warned, "I'll spill your guts here and now if you don't turn her loose." Harry hesitated, then stepped back. The yawning muzzle of the gun followed him unwaveringly, and through set teeth, Pat warned the others. "First man to make a move towards his gun gets Harry drilled plumb center." And then to the girl he said softly, "You come on over here to me." Helen lifted her head proudly and stared at him. She was about to refuse, then she blinked 2 tears from her eyes and obeyed him, crying out, "I can't stand any more shooting and killing. Don't let me be the cause of—" "Shut up!" Pat was backing slowly towards the door. He caught her hand and drew her along with him. "First one comes out this door gets a belly full of lead," he promised the room full of men. He groped behind him for the knob, turned it, and backed out into the darkness of night. Helen cried out and tried to wrench herself away from him as the door swung shut. He jerked her back and held her tightly while warning in a hoarse voice, "You'll be a whole lot better out here with me than inside with them. If we work it right, maybe we can make it out of here." Helen's strength went away from her suddenly. Her body went limp, and she would have crumpled to the ground if Pat hadn't slipped his arm about her waist. Supporting her, he backed his way carefully towards the corrals where the unsaddled horses had been put. End of chapter 5.